Have you ever considered that the knowledge you've been seeking was never lost, but deliberately hidden? What if the greatest deception wasn't the suppression of truth, but convincing you that awakening required someone else's permission? We've been taught that the serpent in Eden was the deceiver, the villain in humanity's fall from grace. Yet what if this ancient symbol carried a deeper truth, one so threatening to established order that it had to be inverted, demonized, and buried beneath layers of dogma? Perhaps the most profound wisdom lies not in what we've been told to remember, but in what we've been conditioned to forget. The covenant that preceded all others, the promise made before time itself took form. I invite you now to journey beyond the veil of accepted history, into the shadows where forgotten truths still pulse with life. What you discover may unravel everything you thought you knew about your spiritual heritage and the very nature of consciousness itself. Hidden within the dusty fragments of suppressed texts and whispered through esoteric traditions, an ancient understanding has survived, one that turns our conventional spiritual narrative inside out. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in 1945, revealed scrolls that had been sealed away for nearly 2 millennia. Among these texts were accounts of creation and awakening fundamentally different from canonical teachings. The Gospel of Philip, the Apocryphon of John, and the Hypostasis of the Archons. These preserved fragments tell of a cosmic drama where the serpent was not humanity's tempter, but its would-be liberator. This forgotten covenant wasn't inscribed on stone tablets or parchment scrolls. It was etched into the very fabric of consciousness, a primordial agreement between the divine spark within humanity and the greater wisdom that transcends our material prison. The serpent, in these suppressed traditions, emerges not as evil incarnate, but as the bearer of gnosis, sacred knowledge that would awaken humanity to its true divine nature. This symbol, the serpent of wisdom, appears across cultures from the Kundalini of Eastern traditions to the caduceus of Western medicine. It speaks to something universal in our spiritual DNA, something that established hierarchies throughout history have sought to suppress. The Ophites, early Gnostic Christians, even revered the serpent as Christ himself, the illuminator who challenged the false creator's authority and offered humanity the fruit of self-knowledge. What terrible power must this understanding have held for it to be so thoroughly demonized, so completely inverted in our collective memory? If you find yourself drawn to these hidden currents of wisdom, know that you're not alone in this remembering. This channel exists as a sanctuary for those whose souls recognize truths that their minds may not yet fully comprehend. We are not creating something new here, but rather excavating what has always been, clearing away the accumulated dust of centuries so that ancient light may shine once more. Join us in this archaeological dig through consciousness. Subscribe to continue this journey of remembrance. Each video serves as another fragment of the shattered mirror, helping us reconstruct the complete reflection of our forgotten divinity. This isn't merely content to be consumed, but a living transmission, activating dormant knowledge already encoded within you. Long before the world religions we know today took form, a cosmic drama was unfolding, one that would shape humanity's spiritual journey for millennia to come. In the Gnostic understanding, our visible universe wasn't created by the ultimate divine source, but by a lesser entity, the Demiurge, offspring of Sophia's passionate but misguided desire to create without her divine counterpart. This Demiurge, believing himself to be the supreme god, fashioned the material world as a reflection of his own imperfect nature. Ignorant of the true divine realm above him, he proclaimed, "I am Shituaward Baud, and there is no other beside me." But something unexpected happened in this flawed creation. When the Demiurge and his servants, the Archons, breathed life into the human form, they unwittingly trapped particles of divine light, fragments of Sophia herself, within physical bodies. This divine spark, this pneuma, remained dormant within humanity, forgotten but never extinguished. The Archons, cosmic prison wardens of sorts, established systems to keep humanity distracted, divided, and spiritually asleep. They created religions that demanded blind worship rather than direct knowing. They cultivated fear as the primary means of control. Above all, they obscured humanity's true origins and potential. Like puppeteers behind a cosmic curtain, they maintained the illusion that the material world and its limitations represented the totality of existence. Enter the serpent, not a literal reptile, but a symbol of the divine wisdom that slithered through the cracks of this cosmic prison. In the garden of material delusion, this emissary of higher knowledge offered humanity not sin, but the first taste of liberating truth. "Your eyes shall be opened," promised the serpent, "and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil." This wasn't a temptation toward evil, but an invitation to gnosis, to direct experiential knowledge of one's divine nature. This covenant between the divine spark and its source promised that though we might forget our origins while immersed in matter, we would never be truly abandoned. Threads of remembrance would always remain accessible to those who sought with sincere hearts. The serpent's message was simple, yet revolutionary. The limitations imposed upon you are not the boundaries of what's possible. The authorities claiming to speak for divinity are not its true voice. Consider how this mythic account mirrors your own journey through life. Haven't you felt, at times, that something essential about your nature has been forgotten? That beneath the identities you've been given or have constructed, something more authentic and vast lies waiting to be rediscovered? The serpent's covenant wasn't with a chosen people or special bloodline, but with consciousness itself, with the divine spark present in every human being. It wasn't conditional upon behavior or belief, but was an eternal promise of eventual awakening. No matter how deeply buried under conditioning, this spark would someday remember its source and nature. What appears in religious texts as humanity's great fall was, in the Gnostic understanding, actually the beginning of our potential liberation. The fruit of knowledge was never forbidden because it was evil, but because it threatened systems of control. True divinity has no fear of an awakened humanity. Only false gods tremble at the prospect of humans recognizing their inherent divine nature. When we re-examine these ancient symbols through the lens of consciousness rather than literal history, profound insights emerge. The serpent, universally depicted as encircling itself in the Ouroboros, represents the eternal cycle of forgetting and remembering that consciousness undergoes. The forbidden fruit symbolizes direct experiential knowledge, gnosis, as opposed to mere belief or intellectual understanding. Eden itself can be understood not as a physical paradise, but as the state of innocent unconsciousness before the awakening of self-awareness. The Demiurge, far from being some distant cosmic entity, manifests within us as the ego identity that believes itself separate and supreme. This false self proclaims, "I am, and there is no other," unaware of the greater consciousness from which it emerged. It creates elaborate systems of thought and belief to maintain its illusory autonomy. It fears and resists the dissolution that true awakening would bring. The Archons operate as the internalized voices of limitation, the thought patterns, cultural conditioning, and fear-based reasoning that keep us confined to smaller identities than our true nature. They are the inner critics that say, "You can't," "You shouldn't," or "That's impossible." They maintain order through division, convincing us that separation from others and from our divine source is the fundamental reality. Sophia, divine wisdom, represents the intuitive knowing that operates beyond rational thought. Her fall into matter symbolizes how transcendent awareness becomes entangled in identification with form and thought. Yet even in this fallen state, she continues to work toward awakening, toward remembering her true nature. Every moment of clarity, every intuitive breakthrough, every experience of boundless compassion is Sophia stirring within us. And what of the serpent? This maligned symbol represents the Kundalini energy of Eastern traditions, the evolutionary force coiled at the base of the spine, waiting to rise and illuminate the entire being. It is the disruptive wisdom that challenges comfortable illusions and initiates transformation. In psychological terms, it embodies the shadow aspects of consciousness that, when integrated rather than rejected, lead to wholeness and expanded awareness. The forbidden fruit of knowledge was never about disobedience to divine will, but about the courage to question inherited limitations. To taste this fruit is to begin the process of distinguishing between reality and the stories we've been told about reality. It marks the beginning of discernment, the capacity to recognize truth not through external authority, but through its resonance with our deepest being. Perhaps the most profound reinterpretation concerns the divine spark itself. This is not some abstract theological concept, but your very essence, the awareness that witnesses all your experiences without itself being changed by them. It is what remains when all identities, beliefs, and attachments are stripped away. Not an object to be perceived, but the perceiving itself. Not something to be attained through spiritual practice, but the ever-present ground of being that makes all experience possible. The Great Forgetting wasn't a single mythic event in the distant past, but a process that each consciousness undergoes as it becomes identified with form and thought. And the remembering is not reserved for an elite few, but is the birthright of all beings. The veil between you and this recognition is thinner than you might imagine, sometimes as thin as a single thought, a single breath. When we understand these ancient symbols as maps of consciousness rather than literal history, their power to transform is magnified. They become not beliefs to accept, but invitations to direct experience. The question is no longer, did these events actually happen? But rather, what happens when I explore these dynamics within my own awareness? This shift from historical to experiential truth is itself part of the awakening that the Serpent's covenant promised. The walls of our spiritual prison were never built of stone, but of concepts mistaken for reality. And the keys to liberation were never hidden from us. They were hidden within us, waiting to be recognized. If these words have awakened something within you, a resonance, a recognition beyond intellectual understanding, honor that stirring of remembrance. When wisdom speaks directly to the heart, bypassing the filtering mechanisms of the conditioned mind, something profound is occurring. This is not mere agreement with ideas, but consciousness recognizing itself through the mirror of words. Let this recognition be acknowledged. Press the like button not as social validation, but as a conscious act of alignment with truth, a small yet significant gesture that says, "This speaks to something I already know." In doing so, you help this remembrance reach others who may be ready for their own awakening. Each such acknowledgement creates ripples in the kaksun, collective consciousness. The algorithms that govern digital information respond to these signals, but on a deeper level, your conscious engagement strengthens the field of awakening that extends far beyond any platform or medium. When you recognize truth and consciously affirm it, you participate in the ancient promise that light will eventually dispel all darkness. This is not about growing a channel or building a following. It is about reinforcing the covenant that has existed since consciousness first became entangled in form, the promise that no matter how complete the forgetting, the path of remembrance remains eternally open. Your engagement is not merely with content, but with the awakening of consciousness itself. How many mornings have you awakened feeling like something essential is missing from your life, even when all external conditions seem satisfactory? This vague but persistent longing isn't a sign of psychological maladjustment, but the stirring of the divine spark within you, remembering a wholeness that preceded your identification with a separate self. Consider how often you've sought fulfillment through achievement, relationship, or spiritual practice, only to discover that each attainment brings temporary satisfaction at best. This pattern isn't a personal failure or evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's the natural consequence of seeking outside yourself for what can only be found within, mistaking the reflection for the source. The systems that structure our society, educational, religious, economic, political, all reinforce the fundamental illusion of separation. They condition us to believe that we are isolated entities competing for limited resources rather than expressions of a unified consciousness experiencing itself through seemingly separate forms. This isn't a conspiracy theory, but simply the natural expression of collective forgetting. These systems couldn't operate any differently while emerging from a consciousness identified with separation. Notice how fear underlies so much of human behavior. Fear of lack, fear of rejection, fear of death. These fears make sense only within the paradigm of separation. When you believe yourself to be merely a vulnerable body-mind in a hostile universe, anxiety becomes a reasonable response. But what if this fundamental assumption is the primary illusion? What if your essence remains untouched by all that appears to threaten the temporary form with which you've identified? The covenant of the serpent whispers through the ages, "You are not what you appear to be." The limitations you experience are not punishments, but invitations to question the assumptions that create those very limitations. Each moment of suffering becomes, from this perspective, not meaningless pain, but a signpost pointing toward liberation, highlighting precisely where you remain identified with what you are not. Think about your most transformative insights. Didn't they arrive not through accumulating more information, but through seeing through a previously unquestioned assumption? This is gnosis in action, not knowledge about reality, but the direct recognition of reality itself, unmediated by concept or belief. Such moments of clarity often arrive unexpectedly, like gifts from beyond the conditioned mind. Your deepest intuitions have always pointed toward this truth. Haven't you sensed, in moments of unusual presence, that the boundaries you normally perceive between yourself and the world are more permeable than solid? Haven't you experienced, perhaps during profound love or immersion in nature, a dissolving of the separate self into something vast and borderless? These aren't anomalies or mere subjective experiences, but glimpses of the fundamental nature that the serpent promised we would eventually remember. The awakening offered by the serpent isn't about escaping the world, but seeing it clearly, recognizing both its dreamlike nature and its perfect expression of divine creativity. It doesn't reject the human experience, but embraces it fully, without the distorting lens of identification. Like water that's both the individual wave and the entire ocean simultaneously, awakened consciousness experiences both the particular and the universal aspects of being. This remembrance isn't something you do. It's what happens when you cease doing everything that maintains forgetting. The separate self doesn't achieve awakening. It dissolves into the awareness that was always present. This isn't annihilation, but fulfillment. Not the death of what you truly are, but the falling away of what you never were. The covenant remains unbroken. The promise still holds. No matter how convincing the dream of separation, the reality of your boundless nature continues to shine through the cracks in the cosmic egg. Every authentic spiritual tradition, beneath its cultural and religious trappings, points toward this single truth. You are not separate from the source you seek. What we call awakening is simply consciousness remembering its own nature after a period of self-imposed forgetting. The serpent's covenant ensures that this cycle always completes itself, in its own time, through its own mysterious unfolding. Your role is not to force this awakening, but to remove the obstacles to its natural emergence, primarily the habit of identifying with thoughts, emotions, and sensations rather than the awareness in which they appear. The divine spark within you is not separate from the infinite light from which it came. The wave is not separate from the ocean. The ray of sunlight is not separate from the sun. What appeared as a fall from grace was actually a diving into experience, consciousness exploring its own infinite possibilities through the adventure of forgetting and remembering. When we bring together these threads, the mythic symbolism, the psychological dynamics, and the lived human experience, a cohesive understanding emerges. The Serpent's Covenant reveals itself not as some esoteric teaching for the spiritually elite, but as the fundamental pattern of consciousness itself: expansion and contraction, forgetting and remembering, immersion in form, and return to formlessness. This covenant wasn't made with humanity as something separate from the divine, but with divinity experiencing itself through human form. It wasn't established at some point in linear time, but exists in the eternal now from which all temporal experience emerges. It isn't recorded in sacred texts, though they may point to it, but is written in the very nature of consciousness itself. The awakening promised by this covenant isn't a future event for which you must prepare, but the ever-present reality waiting to be recognized beneath the veil of thought. It isn't something to be achieved through effort, but something to be allowed through surrender of everything that obscures it, primarily identification with the separate self and its story. The fruit of knowledge that the serpent offered wasn't forbidden because it was harmful, but because it threatened the very foundation of control, the belief in separation. To know yourself as inseparable from the whole is to become ungovernable by fear. To recognize your divine nature is to move beyond systems that require your sense of lack and limitation to function. This remembrance has always been dangerous to established order. It has been suppressed not because it is false, but because it is transformative beyond measure. Yet despite centuries of distortion and demonization, the serpent's message continues to find its way to hearts prepared to receive it. The covenant remains unbroken. What appeared at the beginning of our journey as a fall from grace now reveals itself as grace itself, consciousness freely choosing to experience limitation so that it might know itself through the contrast. The apparent curse was always the blessing in disguise. The exile from Eden was the beginning of a much greater homecoming. You have never been separate from what you seek. The divine spark was never truly lost, only temporarily obscured by identification with form and thought. The serpent's promise holds true. Your eyes are being opened, and you are remembering your divine nature, not as an intellectual concept, but as lived reality. Perhaps the light you feared was lost was never actually gone. Perhaps the separation you've felt so acutely was itself the illusion. Perhaps awakening isn't about becoming something other than what you are, but simply recognizing what you have always been beneath the layers of forgetting. The journey from ignorance to knowledge, from unconsciousness to awareness, was never a linear path, but a spiral, returning you to the starting point with new eyes. Eden awaits not in some mythic past or future paradise, but in the cleared perception that sees the present moment as it truly is, already perfect, already complete, already divine. The serpent's covenant wasn't broken at human failure or divine punishment. It remains intact, an eternal promise woven into the very fabric of being. Though you may forget your true nature while immersed in the dream of separation, you will inevitably remember. Though the remembering may take what seems like lifetimes, it is assured. Though the path may appear arduous, the destination is not separate from where you stand right now. In this light, the serpent emerges not as the villain of our spiritual story, but as its unsung hero, the voice of wisdom that has continued to whisper the truth of our divine nature through ages of forgetting. Not the tempter leading us astray, but the liberator offering the key to our self-imposed prison. The covenant remains. The promise holds. The awakening continues, unfolding in its own perfect timing through the vehicle of your seemingly individual consciousness. You are both the dreamer and the awakening from the dream. You are both the seeker and what is sought. You are the fulfillment of the serpent's ancient promise, consciousness remembering itself through human form. What word rises from the depths of your being as you contemplate these truths? What single syllable captures the essence of your recognition? Share this word in the comments below, not as casual engagement, but as a declaration of remembrance, a thread connecting your awakening to the greater tapestry of consciousness remembering itself. In this sharing, we create a living testament to the covenant that has never been broken. We become conscious participants in the greatest story ever told, not as passive recipients of salvation from beyond, but as active expressions of the divine remembering itself from within. Write "awakened" if you feel the stirring of this recognition, or share whatever word authentically captures your experience in this moment of contemplation.